Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
Good afternoon or good evening, and welcome back to Meanwhile Here on Earth. With me, Peter Robbins, your host, who just seems to have slipped off camera and is now back on. I thought we would start the show today with a passing reference to a writer who passed from the scene last month, the great John le Carré. For me, arguably the greatest spy novelist of all time. If you're into that genre like I am, there are a number of great names, but none greater than le Carré, who was born David Cornwell in beautiful Cornwall, England. Le Carré actually was a spy. He worked for MI5 and MI6 in the late 50s and early 60s, and for non-British non-UK audiences who are not familiar with those terms, they're equivalent to domestic and international espionage, security, criminal overseeing activities of the FBI and CIA. He wrote his first novel, which was not a giant success. It's a book called Call for the Dead. And what it did do, came out in 1961, as I recall. It introduced us to a character, an operative, not a leading character in the agency, named George Smiley, who went on to become immortalized in book after book and rise to the head of full operations at MI6, and played brilliantly by the late, great Alec Guinness. Le Carré, in a recent interview that I heard rebroadcast, talked about writing his first novel in reaction to the then very popular new series of novels about a character named James Bond. And his reason for doing it was to kind of show the real side of that world, which was not necessarily tuxedos, cocktail, save the world, get the girl. These were, if you read the original novels, send-ups, almost cartoons come to life, and the real world of spydom is very different. His setting these tales down is so impressive. For me, I've gone through book after book of his and always been absolutely captivated by his ability to hold his audience with tremendous detail and real knowledge. He made the transition from pre to post-Cold War with a great deal of grace, unlike a lot of his colleagues who were Cold War fiction writers and kind of hit some bumps after that. He died December 12th of being 89 years old, I guess, and was a true craftsman with words. If you are interested in the genre, read his books. You can't do better to get a sense of what that real world is like. And on a related note, I finished a book a couple of weeks ago that I wanted to bring to your attention. It's called Best of Enemies. It is truly the last great spy story of the Cold War and deals with two operatives, one KGB, one CIA, who in the 70s are ordered to turn the other to their side. And both of these guys are very real people. They are iconoclasts. They have no interest or love for the bureaucracy. They're independent operatives. They're both great patriots of their countries. But the most extraordinary thing happens. Although they're unable to turn each other, they become friends, and then extremely good friends. And the narrative is extraordinary. I'm very proud to know the lead writer, Gus Russo, who is one of the finest investigative writers I have ever known or ever read in my life. How he is able to drill down so deeply and so accurately in matters of the Cold War, in his books on organized crime, and his brilliant research into John Kennedy's assassination leaves me in awe. And Gus will be a guest on the show sometime this spring. But it's the kind of absolute nonfiction book that reads just like fiction, not unlike Le Carré's. And with that, I think I've said my piece. And now, a bit about tonight's guest. Robbie Graham has been in pursuit of the UFO mystery for the past 25 years. He has lectured around the world on the UFO topic and has been interviewed for the BBC, the History Channel, Channel 4, Coast to Coast AM, Vice, and Vanity Fair, among numerous other venues. His articles have appeared in numerous publications, including The Guardian, New Statesman, and Fortean Times. He studied cinema at undergraduate and postgraduate levels at Staffordshire University and the University of Bristol, both in the UK, respectively. He is the author of what I feel is the definitive book of its kind right now, and there is nobody I respect more in this area of study. The book is Silver Screen Saucers: Sorting Fact from Fantasy in Hollywood's UFO Movies. Robbie was also the editor of the breakout book, UFOs Reframing the Debate. He runs August Night Press, a publishing imprint in England specializing in anomalistic topics. To learn more about Robbie or the August Night Press, visit robbiegraham.net and augustnightpress.com. And Robbie Graham, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth.
Well, thanks so much, Peter. Pleasure.
How are you doing this evening?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. Not too bad at all. It's pretty cold outside, but it's nice to be talking to you.
We have developed a friendship that could only happen in the modern age here, and it's become even more so where we have gotten to know each other over the last few years and become good friends and colleagues without actually meeting each other yet in corporeal form, as one might say. And I hope that this year, knock wood, I'll be back in the UK toward the end of the summer and we'll actually get to have a beer together or the beverage of our choice.
I'd like that. That'd be great. But yeah, long overdue.
Let's start at the beginning. Where in the UK were you born, and can you tell us a bit about your family?
I was born in a town, well, sort of a city really, called Stoke-on-Trent, and grew up in the West Midlands in the county of Staffordshire, and in a tiny little village called Little Haywood, which is on the edge of Cannock Chase Forest, which happens to be one of the paranormal hotspots of Europe. And I grew up on the edge of this large, expansive forest area. I spent a lot of my childhood in and around those woods. And from an early age, I suppose, I was steeped in the local folklore and mythology surrounding Cannock Chase and this area in general, paranormal, UFOs. But I never really sort of paid serious attention to it, but it was always there in the background. And I suppose looking back now at my childhood, it seems I was always surrounded by these kinds of stories, even from friends who had experienced things sort of directly. And I think really looking back, I never really had much choice in the path that I've followed in life. So yeah, it was a generally, you know, a generally happy childhood. And I had, lots of friends as a kid, and I was always into movies, always into sort of fantasy, sci-fi, adventure movies as a kid. And it was a pretty normal childhood, I suppose. And there's not an awful lot to report other than the experience that a friend of mine had near Cannock Chase, or just on the edge of Cannock Chase, in fact, when I was 7 years old. Which,
can you tell us?
Yeah, it sort of imprinted me, really, and I guess sort of embedded the UFO mystery into my subconscious from an early age, and it never really left. I mean, I can talk to you a little bit about that if you'd like.
Please.
So it have been 1988, 4th of August 1988. Actually, it would have been the 5th of August 1988. I went into school on that morning. I would have been 7 years old, and a friend of mine called Matthew came into the playground, and he was excitedly telling all of the kids about what had happened the night before. And he said that a UFO, a flying saucer, had landed on his family car late that night, and had left a big dent in it, and it was a big, like a terrifying close encounter. And we were all completely mesmerized by this, and didn't really know what to make of it. Quickly dismissed by most people, but I could never really shake it. And I think probably about, several years later, when I was about 18, actually, by this point completely obsessed with UFOs, I decided to go back and speak to him, or speak to his parents, actually, to see if there was any truth to what had happened. And I spoke at length with his parents, who had been in the car, who'd been driving the car, and he and his brother actually had been asleep in the back, and they hadn't seen any of it, but they were just recalling what their parents had experienced. And I interviewed them, and it turned out that, in fact, there had been some kind of encounter on that night, about midnight, as they were turning into the village. And they were crossing a small cobbled bridge. And as they were turning onto that bridge, they nearly crashed into an object that was hovering halfway across the bridge, halfway across the river below. It was about the size of a double-decker bus, they said. It was about 30 feet off the ground, about 30 feet in diameter, and was bejeweled with, around its circumference, with multicolored lights which were flashing slowly on and off. There was a circular pool of mist surrounding the object, which is quite common in these kinds of encounters.
Yes.
And just as the whole thing probably only lasted maybe 30 seconds, and just as they were about to pull onto the bridge, very close to this thing, it raised up, stopped, and then just shot off in the blink of an eye over the neighboring village. And they were so shocked that they decided to pull over their car onto the side of the road to regain their composure. And then they eventually headed home, didn't know what to do, who to call. So they called the police, and they reported it to the police. The next day, possibly because the police maybe press had been listening to the police or something like that, or maybe there's someone in the police mentioned it to the press, or otherwise, the witnesses received a visit from local press the next day, requesting them to take them out to the site, which they did. When they went there the next day, they were greeted. Well, they witnessed a white van that was already there on the scene, and men in sort of white coats beside,
oh my gosh,
taking samples from the from the hedgerows where the object had been,
Oh,
and the hedgerows had been pushed back. Some of them looked burnt, crumpled, and there was a tree in the field directly in the line of motion of the object, which had
yeah.
been pushed over and flattened to the floor, a sapling tree,
Oh,
which to this day is still there and has grown flat to the ground as a full tree, but it's now grown completely to the ground. So this, they were. I mean, to my mind, there was no doubt that these people had experienced
yeah.
something very strange. They were in shock about it still 10 years later after I interviewed them.
Had you
And
ever had you ever conducted an interview of sorts with anybody about this subject before this?
at that point, no, I was only 18.
Yeah.
I did it actually with a guy from the head of the local UFO group.
Oh,
So
great.
when I was 14, so as I say, this encounter had been in the back of my mind since I was 7 years old.
Hmm.
And I'd grown up watching sci-fi movies, E.T., Explorers, also, a lot of the 80s kind of wondrous
Sure.
Spielbergian sci-fi movies, like Flight of the Navigator and things like this. And
Yeah.
so I was always drawn to those kinds of stories. But it wasn't until I was about 14, I was out one afternoon with my family in a bookshop, and I just picked up a book which happened to have a big alien grey face on the front. And it was the very first UFO book I read, and it was what the hell was it called? Oh my God. Alien Magic by Bill Hamilton. Bill F. Hamilton.
Yes, right.
And it was just the cover that drew me to it. And I bought it. It's a really thin volume, and I read it pretty much in a day, and I was completely gripped. It was all it was all the deep conspiratorial Area 51,
Oh, perfect.
alien treaties kind of stuff. And when I was 14, I was just like, this is just completely blown away by it. And then I read it again and again and again, and I just kept buying UFO books at that point. And by the time I was probably 16, I'd read a lot. I'd read, most of Timothy Good's books. I'd read,
Yeah. Oh boy.
I'd read a whole bunch by the time I was 18. And when I was 15, I started attending the Staffordshire UFO group, which was really the only UFO group in the region.
Sakes. Was that held in Rugeley?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the part of Staffordshire that I know and was first introduced to. In fact, I still like to joke with Nick Redfern that we met before he had published the first of his 873 books. No, 874. Just another one clicked in. And I'm a big fan, but I know that area a bit, and I have visited the forest and spoken to quite a number of people who have made it come alive for me. Again, one of the things that makes you so unique to me in the work, there are film scholars who specialize in some ways, or who write about or lecture on certain films of certain periods as allegories for creeping communism, using aliens as the vehicle or subject. There are UFO historians per se, but you are both. And one of the things that makes silver screen saucers so unique in the world of both filmatic literature and UFO literature is you have done your homework. And you not only weave together the history of this genre of science fiction films, starting pretty much in the 50s, but you are able to chronologically overlay it and intercut it with what is going on behind the scenes in terms of government, military, intelligence interest, or impact on, or non-involvement with. And whether or not you're interested in these kind of films, or you're a ufologist and you're not a big film person, all I can tell you is I think I know a certain amount about both subjects, and I learned an awful lot from you. And you're a wonderful storyteller. The way that you lay it out is, you're reading reality, but it draws you along like like a great film would. Which brings up my next question for you before we go on to some initial photos that you've supplied us with. I'm old enough that I grew up seeing some of these, golden age B black and white science fiction classics. Did you have to wait until you got to film school to see films like, Invaders from Mars or This Island Earth or The Day the Earth Stood Still, or did you manage to see some of those when you were younger as well?
Actually, I didn't see a lot of the early flying saucer movies until I started to actively pursue the intersections between UFOs and Hollywood, which wasn't until my probably my late teens. I mean, I'd seen a whole bunch of classic sci-fi movies before that point, but as I say, I mean, I grew up with movies of the time. I didn't even see. I mean, I grew up with movies of the 1980s. I was born in 1981, so I grew up with the Spielbergian kind of sci-fi, wondrous sci-fi, benevolent alien movies, typically of the 1980s and then into the 90s, of course. But it wasn't until I started to actively pursue it that I started to go through the back catalogue of the genre, and and then I immersed myself in it and sort of took it all the way back to the beginning of the subgenre of UFO movies. I mean, I didn't actually see Close Encounters of the Third Kind until I was 16, which was made in 1977, and at that point I was deeply interested in UFOs.
Oh boy, what a film to see at that moment!
Yeah, well, it's a really powerful memory of seeing that for the first time. I watched it with my brother, and I was just completely blown away by it. And then stepped outside just as the sun was going down, just sat and looked out actually over Cannock Chase, because my family home looks out over the forest of Cannock Chase, and literally that's close. And I looked out over the woods and I could see like a shimmering red light that seemed to be darting around in the sky. And me and my brother stood and watched it for ages. And I was convinced, obviously, that it was a UFO. Age 16, just having watched Close Encounters, and eventually realized it was probably like the planet Mars or something. And it has that effect of moving around when, you've got the in the atmosphere. But yeah, that was such a power, and again, that was sort of a testament to the effect that cinema can have on the imagination, and it really did. It for a while, I was convinced I was looking at something, and it had a direct effect. The skeptics obviously argue that a lot of UFO sightings can be attributed to
power of suggestion,
fueled by
desire.
Fueled by the movies that they've watched, and obviously there's some truth to that because I can attest to it. But I was a pretty gullible 16-year-old at the time. But there's a difference between sort of wanting to believe that a shimmering light might be something more than it is, and then there's a difference between that and then actually mistaking a face-to-face encounter with something that's clearly not human. I don't think a movie can really do that. If it's consciously called.
Perhaps schizophrenia or a brain injury, but otherwise, when you have that 30-foot saucer in the road above and ahead of you, that's not a shimmering light in the sky.
No, but of course, I mean, there is the valid argument as well that that cinematic imagery and ideas can, of course, influence us while in suggestive states, like hypnosis, for example, which
Indeed.
of course is entirely probable.
Yeah. At this point, let's take a look at some of these wonderful photos that you provided us with. And who is that young man with the long blonde hair?
With me, I was probably about 2, I guess, maybe not even, about 2 years old. And maybe not even 2. And that would have been at my first family house in Little Haywood, which is just a stone's throw from the Chase, from Cannock Chase, and so my hair is no longer so full or blonde.
And a very thoughtful looking young man you were. Okay, we have 4 rather blonde looking young men here. Can you fill us in on who these people are?
So that's me sat at the front in the green jacket. That's my brother closest to me on the floor,
Right.
Jamie,
Uh-huh.
who's 2 years older than me. And then those are my friends, both called Luke, actually. I've chosen that photograph because actually, if you see directly behind me, there's you can see the back of a green car.
Yes.
And above that, the house that's directly behind that car that you
Yes.
can see, that's the house of the friend who had the UFO encounter.
Ah, perfect.
So that's that, and the house that I lived in at that time was directly across the street from that house.
Okay.
So looking back on it, you know what I mean. The subject was just there in my
Yes.
face
Yep.
from a very, very early age.
Yeah.
At this point, I would have been, I guess, I don't know, 4,
Yep.
5. So it hadn't actually happened yet. The encounter wouldn't have happened
Sure.
until 1988.
Yeah.
But but
A
yeah,
bunch
it
of
was
kids.
always there.
Yeah. Wow. This is you with a friend who looks like it is a kangaroo.
Yeah, that's in Australia. I was only 2 years old there. So
Wow.
so that was Australia on a family trip that we took. I've got a lot of family in Australia.
Got
My
it.
granddad's family moved out there when they were young, and so I've got a lot of cousins in Australia, and that was my first trip to Australia when I was 2 years old. I vaguely remember it.
Ah,
That is Cannock Chase from above. That's a small section of Cannock Chase. It's
yeah.
far more expansive than that. But you can see that there's sort of little villages dotted around the outskirts of it. Mine would be one of those villages, and So this is an area of natural heathland and woodland in the West Midlands of England, and for as long as records have began, this area has been steeped in paranormal
Yes.
mythology, and all sorts of things continue to be reported on and near the chase. You have hundreds of UFO sightings over the years, all sorts of close encounters, alien encounters, black triangles, all kinds of things. You've had ghosts, all sorts of non-human entities,
Yeah.
even Bigfoot, dogmen, everything.
Exactly. Big cats,
Big cats, yeah.
gravity anomalies. I've also done my share of interviews. For clarification for our American audience, just because there are certain words that simply don't jump the cultural boundaries of American English, if that's not an oxymoron, and English. Chase, in this case, is an old word that refers to a forested area, or can it be more finely tuned? Is that basically what we're talking about here?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, that's right, and it's just it's called Cannock Chase or Cannock Chase Woods, Cannock Chase Forest, but people all around the area just refer to it as the Chase.
Yeah. Okay, moving along. And this is a lovely example of the area, at its prettiest.
Yeah, it's just a typical shot of the Chase. I mean, most of it this is not comparable to the American wilderness, for example. The UK is obviously a
Yes.
vastly smaller space, and
Yes.
this is only. I mean, most people in America would consider Cannock Chase just virtually nothing, just like a modest little woodland, which compared to American wilderness, it certainly is. But that doesn't seem to stop it from being home to sorts of
You
bizarre
bet.
phenomena. I suppose I think the fact that it's forested is neither here nor there. I think
Mhm.
when we're talking about areas that do consistently
Yeah.
have reports of anomalous phenomena over many generations, I think what we're looking at here is what Jenny Randalls or other people, 14 researchers, would
Yeah.
refer to as the window area, similar to something like Skinwalker Ranch. And they seem to be dotted all around the world. And perhaps it's where the veil between this world and others
Yeah.
is thick.
There are certain areas that simply are that. I've gone through over the decades every kind of logical way to dismiss such window areas or whatever we wanted to refer to them as. We have one in New York State, a few hours from here, centered around a little hamlet. I can't even call it a village, called Pine Bush, which, like Cannock Chase, has become well known in the literature for having just an off the map level of confirmed anomalous events and UFO activity. And another photo capture that I thought, as a photo, it's beautiful. And at the same time, very evocative of kind of the mystery and the tradition that this area embodies.
Yeah, there's just a few of these. You can probably just skip through them. It's just typical, just to give you an idea of the general. That's typically what the chase looks like wherever you go, and it's mainly sort of heathland, a huge amount of ferns, and various forested areas. It's quite a creepy area. You can spend several hours out there walking around, see absolutely no one at all, and there's a sort of a creepiness about particularly some parts of the chase. There's a particular area surrounding a German war cemetery, and that area, fittingly enough, is where the highest concentration of paranormal and ufological reports come in from.
Not the place that you're going to want to go on your own after dark.
No, well, no, not really, not unless you're a bit mad.
I feel the same way about areas that I've visited, I'm sure, dozens of times over the decades, in the Rendlesham Forest, which also is evocative, quite beautiful in its own way, although not with the history of the chase. But yes, the only times I've ever been out there at night have always been not on my own. Okay, a bit of a change here. Tell us about this photo.
Well, I included that one just because that's taken from Cannock Chase, looking out over Rugeley Power Station, and that was where the witness worked. So he was working there at the time he saw. So this is the sighting of August 4th, 1988, that I talked about before when I was a kid. The guy who was driving the car, a guy named Reg, he was working at that power station at the time. So again, and also I included it because a few months prior to that sighting, so that sighting actually was part of a broader UFO wave that was taking place over Staffordshire that had begun in 1987 and went through to about 1989, but it sort of peaked in 1988. And on May the 16th, 1988, a number of witnesses were stood in a sort of similar position to what you're looking at there, looking out over Rugeley Power Station, and witnessed three large black triangular objects hovering directly over the power station. And those kinds of black triangles were seen all over Staffordshire during this period, and there were a lot of glowing orange orbs as well, as well as what might be traditionally described as flying saucers. There were also alien encounters. It's really, really fascinating, and of course, that parallels with what was going on in Belgium and Europe. Europe at the time as well. So just to give you an idea of this was kind of place I grew up in, really. And so I never really thought of it at the time, though. It just seemed all normal to me. And then looking back, I realized, well, why have I chosen such a bizarre life? I didn't really choose it.
You didn't have a chance.
That's the bridge that the sighting, the encounter of the close encounter of the second kind occurred on. The witnesses would have been driving their car towards the left-hand side of the frame there. There's a road that runs just off the left-hand side of the frame there. And if you skip forward, so that's the opposite side of the bridge. So now if you're looking, so that is now looking, you see those trees that you can see at the opposite side of the bridge. That's the outskirts of Cannock Chase there.
Got it.
And that bridge is leading towards us. That's leading into the village where I grew up. Yeah, if you follow that bridge over, that's the village that I grew up in.
I see.
Just on the opposite side of that bridge. And if you flip back, so if you actually stay there, sorry, if you Actually, yeah, keep there. The UFO, according to the witnesses, would have been hovering halfway across that bridge,
Oh my
about
gosh.
30 feet above the bridge there, and halfway over the river, which is beneath the bridge. And they would have been turning onto the bridge from the left-hand side of the frame as we're looking at it.
Hmm.
And they stopped sort of just as they were getting onto the bridge. The object lifted up and shot away in the blink of an eye. And then if you skip over to the next picture.
Let's move on. This is you and CP30.
Yeah, that was New York. I went to the New York Film Academy in 2003, and just spent a few weeks in New York, and
Great.
that was a fun experience. So I still at this point hadn't really. This was where by this point I'd become much more interested in film and film studies, and I was very much immersed in sort of film scholarship, and I'd sort of let go of UFOs by this point. I had several years as a teenager. I was completely obsessed with it, and then my obsession turned to film.
Yeah.
And then, so this was that period in my life when I was 2000. I'd have been 22 there.
Wow.
I was 2005, so I'd have been like 24. And that was in Bristol when I was at the University of Bristol studying my master's degree in cinema studies. So still just very much my whole life at this point was just film. I was completely obsessed.
It's a wonderful portrait of you, because there you are against these reproductions of some of the greatest films, of the 20th century for what they are. And it's just a great tableau. It's wonderful to see. Okay, now we move ahead a bit, and here you are with two recognizable figures. Tell us who's on the dais there with you.
So that's Terje Toftnes, a Norwegian filmmaker and researcher next to me, and then George Knapp on the end there. That was at the Exopolitics conference of 2014 in Copenhagen, Denmark, and we were the three speakers at that event, and that was a great opportunity to meet those guys and spend some time with them, and the hosts of the event, Pia Knudsen, and I got to meet a bunch of really interesting people out there, and that was a really great experience. I've always had great respect for George Knapp, and it was great to sort of have a chat with him about, we'd spoken before that, but never met before, and it was good to just sort of have a talk with him about, well, in particular, Bob Lazar. I had a number of theories about Bob Lazar and what exactly went on there, and what was really behind that story. And I presented some theories to George Knapp, and it was interesting to see that he agreed.
Yes. George, of course, is in a class by himself in terms of journalists who are deeply involved in this subject. Terry, lesser known to an American audience, but one of the most distinguished and praised documentary filmmakers in Europe, who some years back we were in contact, and he was in New York City. It was the dead of winter. It snowed in up here, basically. And he said, I want to film you for the documentary I'm working on. I can't get down to the city now. Well, then we will come up and visit you. And I thought, you're going to be driving through a lot of snow. And he laughed on the phone and said, we're Norwegian. And he and his partner came up and stayed for several days, and we had a grand time. Also, the Danish UFO research community are spectacular, such wonderful people. And I can't say enough about them in a positive sense. I love Denmark and the Danes in Copenhagen, so I hope you had the kind of experience that would reflect that.
Yeah, it was great. It was a really great time, and it was a really interesting conference as well. And Terje was great as well. It was fantastic.
Yeah. Okay. We move along here, and the gentleman second from the left, who is one of the most legendary figures in the world of UFO studies like ever. Who are these three people with you?
So that's Diana Pasulka next to me, who's the author of American Cosmic, professor of religious studies at Wilmington, North Carolina, University of North Carolina, Wilmington.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that's Jacques Vallée, and that's Dr. Christopher Lawson, Canadian scholar who's one of the leading sort of academic experts on the poltergeist phenomenon in the world. And this was at Esalen in California, at the Esalen Institute in California in October of 2014, and we were invited to take part in a private symposium discussing notions of the imaginal. And I was and Diana and I were talking about UFOs. Jacques was talking about synchronicities, actually.
Interesting.
And Chris was talking about poltergeists. But it was amazing, absolutely amazing week. We spent a week there, and it was Jeff Kripal, Professor Jeff Kripal was there. Alex Gray, the visionary artist.
Sure.
It was, it's just absolutely mind blowing.
And what a location!
Yeah, it was really one of the best times of my life, and that was fantastic, and it was great to be able to to spend some time with Jacques Vallée and pick his brain, and
exactly.
There is, and that was the first time I met Diana as well. We'd been in touch because we were doing similar research around the same time. And Diana, it was actually Diana who got me invited to speak there because she'd followed some of my work, and we were both exploring ideas surrounding hyperreality and the power of cinema in relation to culture, and so she sort of reached out to me and eventually, and she recommended me to Jeff Kripal, who invited me to speak there. But it was really great. There's an interesting, slightly embarrassing story, if you want to hear it, about Jacques.
Sure.
Why not? So on the final day, so on the final evening, we all had sort of like I guess like a banquet. Everything's vegan at Esalen, by the way. So we had like a vegan banquet, and I ate way too much, like ridiculous amount, and I also drank too much. And the next morning I felt really bad, and then it turned out that we were being driven back up to San Francisco by Jacques and his wife. So it was Diana and me being driven back to San Francisco by Jacques and his wife in Jacques' car.
Wow.
And so that was like a long drive, 2 or 3 hour drive, I guess, around really, really winding roads.
Oh, no.
Big Sur and all that.
I don't like where this is going. Keep going.
California coast. And then halfway we stop in Santa Cruz, and Jacques buys us lunch. And I have like some huge Mexican burrito lunch.
Oh.
Like, by the way, American portions are like 3 times the size of Britain's largest portions of anything.
Yeah.
And and I ate it all and got back in the car. And and I was in the back of the car, and it was really hot. There was really no air conditioning or anything. It was really hot, and it was, oh my God, I felt desperately ill even before I got back in the car. And
heading for a paranormal experience here, it sounds like.
And I said, and Jacques was giving actually Diana talks about, she refers to this day in the opening to her book American Cosmic, and she mentions the fact that we were all being driven by Jacques up to San Francisco. What she doesn't mention in her book is what happened.
That was very gracious of her, I think.
It was very gracious of her. But Jacques will definitely never forget me. And I said, he was giving us this tour, this like basically private tour of the area and all this like ufological history and everything, and it was amazing. once in a lifetime opportunity. And I said, I'm really sorry. Like, I feel really ill. Would you mind if I sat in the front?
Oh no!
So Jacques is like super nice, and he's like, "Oh, not at all. You can come and sit in the front." And then,
Oh no!
so I was now sat next to Jacques, and Diana and his wife were in the back.
As opposed to saying, "Can you please stop the car and let me go?"
Yeah, well, I thought I thought I might be able to save myself by sitting in the front. And then the talk continued, and after a while, I had to just say, "I'm really sorry. I'm gonna be sick. I need to get out of the car." So he stopped, and I won't go into detail, but it was not pleasant, and and Jacques was so worried. He was so nice, and then we carried on, and then another 15 minutes passed, and then we stopped again. And then it got worse, and then we carried on, and then this went on for about, we must have stopped 3 or 4 times, and every time was worse than the last.
Jeez. Well, it says something about all of that stuff about vegan food, and I don't know.
But I was pleased at least that I didn't get it in his car.
Good man.
And then anyway, we finally got to San Francisco, and I was just an absolute. I've never felt so bad in my physical wreck. We got there, said goodbye. He'd given me a signed copy of one of his. He signed a copy of one of his books that he found in his boot. Gave it to me.
Right.
And then I realized, and then I was sort of splayed myself out on the hotel bed, just wanting to die. And then about half an hour later, I get a phone call from the lobby, and they say, "We've got a call for you." And I answered the phone, and it's Jacques. And I've left my coat in his car, and he's driven back to San Francisco.
Oh no! No, he won't forget you, Robbie. There's no question about that.
He was so nice, and then he came back. He drove back to the hotel with the coat.
Oh, what a good guy!
He was just so good about it. He was so nice. But that was my unforgettable experience with Jacques.
Talk about having a high and a low in one particular body of experience. For our listeners who are fairly new to the subject of UFO studies, Jacques Vallée is one of the most respected, most influential figures in the work going back to the 1960s. He does not necessarily subscribe to a hard metal under intelligent control by advanced beings theory to all UFO phenomena, to put it mildly. But because he is smart, thoughtful, extremely knowledgeable in science and other areas of study, he has made such a unique contribution to the work. And you, Robbie, have made a unique contribution to his memory bank. We're going to be coming into a break in a few minutes, but this is a great-looking crew of people here, and there you are right next to Jacques. Was this the group of folks with the Esalen Institute lecture?
Yeah, it was. That was the people who comprised the Imagine All Symposium that year, and you've got Jeff Kripal at the front there, Alex Gray, the artist, directly behind him. You can see Diana there, and a few others. I mean, all of them. I mean, all of those people are. I mean, they're all just sort of top academics in their fields, and I was just thinking, what the hell am I doing here? How did I even get here? So I was, once in a lifetime opportunity. I managed to sort of find my way there somehow and get through it. So,
well, I think one of the greatest perks, if you will, although this is fascinating work, it's not an easy way to make even part of a living. But if you're fortunate and you work hard and you make contributions that other people recognize, you have an opportunity to occasionally go places that you would never be able to travel to or wouldn't have traveled to otherwise, and meet some of the most memorable, interesting, thoughtful people that you're ever going to meet in your life. For me, these are high points of my life, conference events like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And what I'm going to do right now is tell our listeners and viewers that this is Peter Robbins and Robbie Graham on Meanwhile, here on Earth, KGRA Digital Broadcasting, and we are going to be taking a quick break, and we will see or you will hear us when we return.
Are you intrigued by Paranormal Talk Radio? You'll love the new Paranormal Radio app from TalkStream Live. You'll find a great selection of talk shows covering UFOs, ghosts, strange phenomena, and much more. Download the Paranormal Radio app now and start listening to the very best in paranormal talk entertainment, including the network you're listening to right now. The Paranormal Radio app, free in Google Play and the iOS App Store.
Are you still at it?
Yeah, I need more speed.
This baby's fast.
My dad's fast. He's scary fast.
You really think you could beat him?
Yeah, because I drink more tea than he does.
Yeah, right.
You know, pal, it's the tea that makes you go. Oh. Hey, Dad.
You know, kiddo, you have to drink a lot more tea to be faster than me.
Drink the tea that makes you go. Life Change Tea. You may not need as much as Dad. You never know. GetTheTea.com. Log on to GetTheTea.com.
Welcome to the new KGRA digital broadcasting website, thekgradb.com. Here you'll find great new content, including the KGRA Classics, great shows from our archives. You'll be able to see the show times and information so you can see what show is currently on air. The on-air live button, so just go to this section and you'll be able to hear the show live with exceptional sound quality. We also have the Vault section. Make sure to subscribe to get access to great content and special features. We have the make content for our latest news and events, so make sure to sign up and you can be part of our forum. So make sure to check out the new KGRA digital broadcasting website, thekgradb.com. We look forward to seeing you there, and we hope that you enjoy the new website.
Mainstream media's most wanted. KGRAradio.com.
Well, meanwhile, here on Earth, you have returned to join Robbie Graham and Peter Robbins as we continue our conversation. And actually, that break was quite perfectly timed, even if not fully planned, because we now actually move into the wonderful world of film and UFO. And Robbie, my first question for you is, again, I could go on about how much I really admire your work here and what a terrific book it is, and I will. But how long did it take you from inception to completion to do this, to write this extraordinary book and do the research that needed to be done before starting to lay out the narrative?
Oh, too long. Probably. I mean, there's virtually a decade's worth of research gone into it, but it took about 4 solid years to write, probably a bit longer, maybe 5 years in the writing process. It just took a very long time. I'm a slow writer, but also it was a mammoth task.
Yes, it is.
Because what I wanted to do was make this accessible to anyone, whether they didn't know any, if you've never read a book about UFOs or movies before, I wanted to make it accessible to everybody. So I had to lay out a narrative of ufological history.
Yes.
And also how that then sort of intersects in parallel with Hollywood's engagement with the UFO phenomenon. And I also wanted to, I knew from the outset that it was always very clear to me that contrary to the unthought out skeptical argument that the UFO phenomenon is the result of overactive imaginations fueled by Hollywood. I always thought, well, it seems to be vice versa. It seemed to me that Hollywood seemed to be feeding off the UFO subculture.
Yes.
The phenomenon itself predated Hollywood's depictions of it by at least 3 years.
Yeah.
And then what I found was that as the UFO mythology, the UFO subculture, ufology itself began to evolve and develop, Hollywood creatives, writers, directors, producers started to look to that rich body of material for creative inspiration.
Yep.
And then they mined that, and then they sort of, it was reflected then in the science fictional output of Hollywood.
Yes.
But then there is a certain amount of feedback that goes on between the two, and it becomes like then it becomes really hard after a point to distinguish what influenced what and at what point.
Yes.
But for the most part, you can, and I do, clearly point out those historical events basically that have fueled the Hollywood narrative, really. So it begins in about 1947 with the birth of the modern UFO phenomenon as we understand it today. But then Hollywood's first significant engagement with the subject started in 1950, which happened 3 years after, obviously, the Kenneth Arnold sighting. And then ever since then, Hollywood has been looking to ufology for creative inspiration, and that's intensified as the years have gone on.
Well, I'm so glad you pointed it out as such, because it was one of the things that struck me on a number of levels, in part because one of the challenges I set for myself in taking on the role of being a host of a weekly live radio program was to find a way to engage people like us that follow this subject, are knowledgeable about it, and want to add intelligent listening or viewing to our schedule. And equally as important, people who aren't interested or weren't interested or could have cared less or would never have gone out of their way to listen to a program like this. And your book epitomizes it, because in fact, you were very successful in the goal that you set out, to find a way. Somebody like me, who is a complete and total film geek since I was 7 years old, and maybe even younger, and steeped in knowledge about the UFO subject, an avid reader, a fellow researcher, it appealed to me on many levels. But if you were somebody who is just a film lover, but no real interest in UFO studies, it's a book for your library. If you are a ufologist or serious student or a beginning student of this subject, it's an important book for your library. If you're just starting out and you like movies, and you always have, but you're beginning to educate yourself about the UFO phenomena and want to see how it crosses over into the world of popular culture, it's a book that functions so well on all those levels. And again, as I mentioned to you before, I think of myself as fairly knowledgeable in the subject, but I learned things. And a perfect example was you're taking post-war history of the American intelligence community, superimposing it on different presidential administrations, superimposing on that the films that were coming out, the people that were making the films. And you mentioned an individual who I was simply not aware of, and I feel I should know who this guy is, C.D. Jackson, who was a good friend, a very close friend of Walt Disney's, and who happened to be the chief propagandist for President Eisenhower's administration. Can you tell us a bit about him and how he comes into the story at the moment that he does?
So C.D. Jackson, Charles Douglas Jackson, was the head of psychological strategy at the time. And the government's chief propagandist. And he was close friends, as you say, with Walt Disney, but also with Darryl Zanuck, And Zanuck, of course, so Daryl Zanuck was the head of 20th Century Fox, one of the most powerful and influential people in Hollywood during the entire era. But of course, Zanuck also had a history as a propagandist himself during the Second World War, as did many people in Hollywood at the time. I think that people seem to forget that so many influential individuals in Hollywood had come from a propagandist background during the Second World War, working for the US military in various capacities. And the CIA, of course, really started to get a foothold in Hollywood in the early 1950s, formally, officially, through what we know through declassified government documentation in about 1953.
Robertson panel.
Roberts, which of course also happened with the Robertson panel as well. But even beyond the Robertson panel, the CIA started to get its hooks into all manner of genre pictures unrelated to UFOs in around 1952, 1953, because they recognized the power of cinema to influence popular perceptions of everything. And so if you want to control how people think, then you need to control the images that they're consuming and the narratives that connect those images. You need to narrativize things for people. People like a good, life doesn't make sense, but movies usually do. And so you can crystallize and simplify very complex ideas through cinema in the form of narrative, propelled and anchored by powerful images. And the CIA recognized that at a very early stage, and they wanted to really get their hooks into Hollywood, which they did. And by the late 1950s, I mean, there was no aspect of Hollywood that didn't have that wasn't under some form of influence by either the CIA or various different branches of the US government. And it just makes sense that would be the case. If you want to control what people think and believe and feel towards, foreign enemies, even in terms of domestic policy, it wasn't just about, waging a psychological Cold War against the Soviets during the time. It was also about shaping belief and ideas about domestic policy as well. Even race relations at the time, and this all came under the purview of the CIA. Now, of course, if they were taking the time to influence movies on issues such as sort of historic race relations and things like that, which they were tampering with scripts. They had script doctors throughout Hollywood. They had the ear of the studio bosses themselves. Many of the actors themselves were connected with the CIA. If they were taking the time to do this across genre pictures like musicals, westerns, comedies, which they were, all of these things, and this is all a matter of historical record now. Then you can be sure that they were also deeply concerned about how the public were perceiving the UFO phenomenon. And my contention is that, so obviously, beginning in the late 1940s, the public at large, worldwide, but especially in America, were really getting fascinated by this burgeoning enigma. And in 1953, with the establishment of the CIA Robertson panel, it was the recommendation that the phenomenon be debunked and demystified through media channels, including Hollywood and specifically Walt Disney, and through television, radio, all mass media. But the blanket, as I say, it was a blanket kind of approach, which was to debunk and demystify. I think what happened was, after a few short years, they recognized that this approach was not going to be working, because the phenomenon itself was not going to go away. And as long as people continued to report and experience this phenomenon, you're going to have a really hard time convincing people that it doesn't exist and that it's nonsense. So I think what they did was they abandoned the blanket debunk and demystify, and instead replaced it with a more subtle approach, which was more along the lines of perception management. If you can't convince people that it doesn't exist, what you can do is you can try to manage how people perceive the phenomenon. And specifically, you can try to manage how people perceive your own relationship, i.e. the government's relationship to the phenomenon. In a way that best serves them. So that's what started to happen in the 1950s. And then you can do this very subtly through popular narratives in supposedly fictional movies, which they are, and they are fictional, but they also include a great deal of ufological sort of fact, shall we say. Yeah. They take ideas from the UFO, from ufology, from the UFO subculture, as reported at a grassroots level.
Yeah.
And then they insert these ideas into ufological narratives in Hollywood. And the effects of this are complex and hard to unravel, but that's what I attempt to do in the book.
Well, one of the things I wanted to mention was early on you made a decision that you would allow yourself to stray from the core subject, namely the UFO phenomena and film, and to move out into the intelligence community's impact in completely other areas of film and the entertainment industry, which I found absolutely riveting. It was not something that I expected in the book. It was kind of like a bonus. And knowing us on a certain level, we could talk about these films that you focused in on and other ones, not just for hours, but for days on end. So not that we're even close to the end of our second hour, but I thought the next thing that I would like to do just very briefly is go through our few remaining images that you've supplied us with. And this is in Wiltshire. I know that area well, and that feeling of being in a crop formation is a very unique feeling. I know you'll agree with me.
Well, so this is actually not Wiltshire. This is why I've included this. I've included this because it's a bit of a weird one for me in terms of my personal story with the whole UFO thing. This is 2016 when I was living in Surrey in the south of England, not too far from London. And I was in a rural area in Surrey. This is quite a long way. This is a couple of 100 miles away from Wiltshire. So a couple of 100 miles in American terms is nothing, but in terms of UK geography, this is quite far away from crop circle country. This is very.
And let me jump in just to say that Wiltshire, in the central south of England, is the largest concentration of fully authentic crop circle and crop formation phenomena every farm season. Continue on.
Yeah, so every year, at least probably 97%, probably even more than that, maybe even 98% of all crop circles appear in the region of the West Country in the UK, Wiltshire and surrounding areas. Virtually, it's very, very few crop circles appear outside of that region annually. Very, very few. You can count them on one hand, pretty much.
Part of the mystery.
Yeah, and this is so they're very, very rare in this region where I'm standing here. Extremely rare. And in 2016, I'd sort of expressed a desire on Facebook. I sort of said, I've never been in a crop circle, never visited Wiltshire, never done that, never made the pilgrimage, never had that experience. By the way, I should say, in terms of crop circles, my personal opinion about crop circles, for what it's worth, is that virtually almost all of them are man-made. I mean, there's overwhelming evidence to suggest that, or a great many of them are, however, despite, I wouldn't say that necessarily all of them are, but even the ones that are surrounded in mystery. I mean, many of the crop circle makers themselves, some of whom I know,
do not know why they do it.
Do not know why they do it. They feel almost paranormally compelled to make the formations, and when they do make them, in some cases, they experience ufological paranormal phenomena whilst making the crop circles themselves, seeing UFOs, seeing orbs, things like that as they're making them. So whatever is going on here, it's more complex, more complicated, and more subtle than just aliens making formations in crop circles, in crop fields. It has there's a close relation to human consciousness and the role that the individual on the ground plays in all of this as well. It's not something external purely that's happening here. But anyway, I was interested. You just got to do it. You've got to go in a crop circle, and I sort of put out a message on Facebook, and I said, "Oh, I intend to maybe go and visit Wiltshire next year and hopefully see a crop circle or whatever." And then a couple of months later, when the season rolled around, I looked online. I was just scrolling the news feed, and I saw a giant crop circle had apparently appeared in Reigate, which was the town where I was. And I thought, whoa, that's strange. And it was a huge alien head. You can't see it from these pictures. You can just about see it. You can see the nostrils and the mouth there. I haven't used an actual picture of it because it's copyrighted, and I didn't want to get you guys in trouble. But I could only take these pictures from the ground. But if you Google Reigate Crop Circle 2016, you'll see what I'm talking about.
How do we spell that? Reigate, Reigate, or if you just put Surrey Crop Circle 2016, you'll see it, and it's a classic grey alien head. And I looked at the location for it. I thought, that's strange, and it was the only crop circle in the entire region during that year, and it was maybe a quarter of a mile from my front door. It was literally I stepped out my front door, walked up one path, and there it was, almost like it was just for me. Like it was just, and there was no one there. And it had appeared the previous day, and someone had taken a picture of it from above in a helicopter and posted it online. And I thought, oh wow, okay. So I just jumped out the front door and virtually ran all the way up this hill, and then I had to find it because I didn't know where it was, and I just had to find it. So I eventually came into a field. And there it was, and there was no one there, just me, and it was all to myself. And it was literally the only one in the entire region that year, and I've never heard of any in that region in recent years. It's extremely rare, and just there it was, a big alien head, and it was at this point, that's me taking a picture of it, and it was at this point prior to this that I was really having a ufological crisis. I was on the verge of leaving the field for good. Wow.
And I hadn't edited UFOs Reframing the Debate by this point, which was my second book, an edited volume. And I was just really disillusioned with the whole field. And this thing appeared like virtually on my doorstep. I thought, oh, well, okay, I suppose I have to, I have to acknowledge it. As a giant alien head appearing on my doorstep is a crop circle out, So there's a whole story that goes along with it, but I won't go into it because it's probably too long. But I wrote an article about it that you can read, and it's called "Making Sense of My Crop Circle Experience." I mean, if you just Google "Making Sense of My Crop Circle Experience," it was quite a strange. What happened there on that day in that crop circle was really quite bizarre. One of the strangest experiences of my life. And it was completely unexpected. And I should say that I've no doubt at all that crop circle was man-made.
I was going to say that when it's so overt, the imagery, that's my intuition as a rule. But I just want to make the one point that no matter, like Project Blue Book, its analyses, by the time it put itself out of business officially, there were still X number of cases that were completely unexplainable in any conventional terms. And we are left with a number of, and it continues to happen every season, that there are crop formations, some of them so extravagantly detailed, and where there are deep physiological changes to the soil, to the crop, the elbow that is created and it starts to grow at a 90-degree angle, that there is plating, braiding, that is, goes clockwise, and then under it is a layer of plated wheat or whatever the crop is going counterclockwise. You can't fake these things. There are particular magnetic resonance signatures, one of which famously blew out some very expensive BBC equipment when the mic was brought into the area. So we are dealing with a multi-leveled phenomena, but like you, I have met and spent time with some of the people who make these things every season, and they break into several groups for me. The ones who kind of are in the heritage of the art school tradition I came out of earthworks and minimalism, where you're creating a work of art, so to say. Very nice. And then there are those who are kind of the tricksters, who want to fool the experts and get their jollies by embarrassing, professionals. The most interesting group, of course, is the one that you referred to, and the one that I've met with people on. We don't know why we do this, but it is a deep obsession, compulsion, and that is where I need to be. That is where I must be. Judge it as you will, but it's a mystery, we can only pay lip service to at this point, but both of us have experienced a bit of it. And I've been lucky enough to spend time in Wiltshire during crop season and visit a number of formations, and hoping next summer we'll be able to go back as well. We have here cover to a real breakthrough piece of UFO literature involving some of the best of the newer generation of contributors to the field that you edited. I found this a really important book that is taking us into a new generation of UFO-related research, development, and kind of philosophy.
Oh, thanks, Peter. Yeah, this was I suppose, the result of my ufological existential crisis that started in around 2013. In 2013, so I should say that I think many people, in my experience, who spend a lot of time in this field, typically, well, they do, but they typically get into it through the simplest approach, which is through the extraterrestrial nuts and bolts hypothesis, whereby we attribute the phenomenon pretty much exclusively to alien visitation, extraterrestrial beings from other planetary systems visiting us in nuts and bolts spacecraft, and tied in with that is the conspiracy narrative as well, whereby the US government in particular
covering up and
has covered it up, but also that they're in league with the extraterrestrials, have signed treaties with them, have successfully reverse engineered their craft, and all of that. Right now, I'm not discounting.
No, the treaty thing is always problematic for me. But
I'm definitely discounting the treaty thing.
Said many times, they don't have to. I'll leave the expletive out, but they don't have to sign a treaty with anybody.
It's so absurd.
In league with, anything is possible, but that for me that's far fetched.
Well, how many treaties do we have with chimps? Right.
Point made.
Yeah, that's it. Point made. So, and they're far more advanced than us, than we are over chimps.
Yes.
Right. So it's absurd. A lot of these conspiratorial narratives, by the way, have demonstrably been sown consciously by disinformation operatives going back to the late 1970s, and then very heavily throughout the 1980s. And I track all of this and show it conclusively in
wonderful part of the book. Yes.
And other people have done this before me. Mark Pilkington, Greg Bishop have done it in their books, Project Beta, and Mark Pilkington in Mirage Men, and others before them as well. I look at this through the lens of Hollywood and look at how Hollywood has picked up on those narratives and how Hollywood has been influenced by certain disinformation operatives, and how particular conspiratorial ideas within ufology have taken a foothold and been projected through Hollywood. But anyway, so what I'm talking about there in terms of the extraterrestrial hypothesis and then the conspiracy theories that go along with that, these things basically are the foundation and the bedrock of what I would term popular ufology.
And all the more so in the last 4 years or so, with the conspiracy culture emanating from the highest levels of American government.
Yeah, I'm highly skeptical, to say the least, and that's a huge understatement, of virtually everything that's come out of the US government. I know this is, a lot of people, especially younger generation of people within the UFO research field who don't even refer to them as UFOs anymore, but UAPs, would find this, offensive or controversial. If that's the case, I would suggest that you do some serious reading on the subject, because look, the entire history of the US government's interactions with this phenomenon and its interactions with the public in relation to the phenomenon have been characterized exclusively for the past 70 years by deception and manipulation and disinformation exclusively.
Yeah.
That's not suddenly changed in 2017 when you've had people come forward from the Pentagon saying that this is what's happening within the US government. They haven't just suddenly become these altruistic agencies who now want to give the public the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. This is simply a continuation of 70 years of perception management, and that's all this is. So you need to be highly, highly skeptical of any statement from any official or semi-official body or individual on this subject.
Yeah.
So
it is interesting, though, how since a series of articles, and it did not begin with the best known of them by the great journalist and UFO scholar in her own right, as well as other paranormal areas, Leslie Kean, and staff writer for the Times, Ralph Blumenthal, and the third writer whose name escapes me, several months before their very well-received piece that accompanied the Navy Flyers account of what had happened to them in the August New York Times and even the Sunday section. America's really ranking UFO statistician, Cheryl Costa. There was a piece, an interview with her that was also very well received on a positive note for what it's worth. Although, the controls are still being maintained, even though part of the control is to seem that there's less control. It's gone from overt repression to maneuvering and more strategizing for me, but that the ridicule factor, which I've gone out of my way to document, and the origins of the ridicule factor, which is a subject unto itself. It seems at this point, we're talking now early 2021 as opposed to late 2017, it is dissipating in terms of the way major media and regular folks are addressing the topic. And it's no more dramatized than if you tune in to a far right who has a show on Fox talking to some authority on the subject or speculating on it. Same thing for CNBC, CNN, much more liberal grounds. Nobody's making fun of it anymore, and that's healthy. But still, the man behind the curtain is still the man behind the curtain.
Yeah, I agree, and I should clarify as well. When I talk about being skeptical of people, I'm certainly not referring to Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal. They're simply reporting the details, and they've done it, and they've done it extremely well. What I'm saying is Leslie and Ralph would surely, as journalists, recognize that everything that they're getting can't entirely be trusted. All they can do is report it as journalists. Exactly. It's a very complicated, very complex issue to unravel. We're in it now. We're in a new era right now. There's no question about it. And we are, I would say, I feel pretty comfortable in saying that we are, I think, moving quite rapidly towards something quite significant.
Yeah.
But I have to say, that worries me. It worries me. And I don't mean to sound alarmist. I'm not worried about the phenomenon. I'm concerned about how it's going to be packaged and presented and exploited.
Thank you. I am too. We see the schools that have always been there going back to the 50s of welcome the Space Brothers. They're here to do away with, hunger and cancer and to make us all kumbaya together, or the wonderful bad aliens from Mars attacks. We are here to destroy you, decimate the Earth, or at least vaporize you, and take over the real estate here. I think we're asking the wrong questions in these areas. Are they good? Are they bad? Forgetting, for starters, that they are probably representative of a myriad of other intelligences from parts unknown, from dimensions unknown, from right here beside you and me in our own rooms, one or two dimensions away, enjoying our chat here. Going back to time immemorial, it's such a big picture. And we human beings, we compartmentalize, we complexify. whatever is going on, Travis Walton once pointed out that if it were a worst case scenario, in so many words, we'd all be down in the salt mines with little Flash Gordon hats on our head, looking straight ahead and mining minerals, and or being vaporized. You know, if they're in control behind the deep state, the secret government, whatever we want to call it, it's a fairly laissez-faire arrangement. And they're allowing us to continue to do our mayhem on each other, to allow our cycle of behavior seemingly to go on. And they're not jumping in to vaporize the pandemic. At the same time, they're not jumping in to vaporize humanity. We can only do our best to theorize, but often I find people are asking the wrong questions because the big picture is too big.
I agree, and that's partly what we were trying to address in the book in reframing the debate. What I wanted to do, I was really disillusioned with popular approaches to understanding this enigma. Yeah. And I thought people were asking the wrong questions. Now, of course, I'm just one in a long line of people who for decades have been saying the same thing. Yeah. Vallée among them, chief among them, John Keel, another one, and many others over the years. And I just sort of thought I got to a point where I had sort of rejected my own. I sort of let go of my own attachment to the neat extraterrestrial hypothesis and all of the theories and ideas that were related to that. Not dismissing it, because clearly, sure. I mean, it's absurd.
It's one of many things that is probably happening.
I think it's fair to say that the phenomenon, as reported at a grassroots level, is representative of something far more complex and multifaceted than simple extraterrestrial visitation. That's not to say that we're not interacting with literal extraterrestrials. We may very well be, but the phenomenon itself is clearly tied to other paranormal phenomena, even cryptozoological phenomena, poltergeist phenomena, consciousness on many levels. Yeah. And it seems in some way, I think we have a tendency to see the phenomenon as something external that is happening to us from which we are separate. Yeah. And that's just not how things work. That's not how it is. That is clearly not how it is at all. We are a part of it. We are a part of the phenomenon. Yeah. The phenomenon, wouldn't necessarily even be without us. We are a part of it. And certainly our consciousness interacts with it and shapes it. In many cases, especially in close encounter cases, and all of the evidence would indicate that this is the case. Now, so what I did is I approached who I considered to be some of the more forward-thinking, progressive, iconoclastic thinkers in the field. Yes. But what I wanted to do was not just have everyone agree with each other. I wanted to get a volume of essays that would challenge the reader and basically make them confused, really, because this is a confusing phenomenon. Now, although it's nice to be able to present a neat narrative, and typically the best-selling books are ones which package everything in a way that's really digestible. Indeed. And typically hooked around the extraterrestrial hypothesis and often hooked in with new age ideas. Yeah. What I wanted to do was to make people feel uncomfortable. And that's what the UFO phenomenon does anyway to us. It makes us feel uncomfortable. It's almost a reflection of the phenomenon itself and how it operates. It's like tricksterish. And there's an element of that in the book as well. So what I wanted to do was get people, for example, like Mike Cleland, who you can see there, who is an experiencer himself and an expert on experiences and has written extensively on the subjective experience of the UFO enigma. That's right. People like Lauren Kutz is also an experiencer. And I wanted to get people who have had the direct UFO experience and who are sympathetic to metaphysical and sort of paranormal interpretations of the phenomenon. But I also wanted to have those people alongside more traditionally materialist, kind of skeptical researchers. For example, who have we got in there? Jack Brewer or Kurt Collins. And I wanted to have those essays literally back to back in conflict with one another. So you'd read an essay, so you'd get to the end of say, Mike Clelland's essay, and then you'd start to formulate a particular view of the phenomenon, and then you'd read the next essay, which would completely contradict what you've just read, and then the next one would contradict that, and so on. Yeah. So by the end of it, you're sort of, what the hell do I believe? And that's the point. We don't want you to come to a conclusion, but we want you to open your mind to different ideas and to feel uncomfortable, and so that was the goal, and I'm not sure how successful it was, but it was definitely controversial. Some people absolutely hated it, while others loved it. So we're developing a second volume now, anyway, in the early stages.
Good. Let's move through some of the other images that you've given us for really bullet pointing some of the minutes that we have left together.
Oh, I've just these are just so yeah. In 2017, which was the year that Reframing the Debate was published, that was published by White Crow Books, and White Crow, the guy who runs that, John Beecher, said to me, "Well, look, I've been wanting to establish an imprint for quite some time, and would you like to run it for me?" So this is where August Night Press began, and since 2017, we've published a handful of titles here. First of all, Engaging the Anomalous by Jack Hunter, which is about sort of mediumship from an academic perspective. And I think, what else have we got there? We've got, if you want to skip on, you can just skip through them. They're literally just, This is just a handful of books that we've published so far. This is by Chris Rutkowski, which is the definitive book so far on the Falcon Lake incident from 1967, which happened in Canada. MJ Benias's first book, sort of looking at the UFO subculture from a kind of a sociological standpoint, which is great. And we've published, 2 or 3 more since then, and we've got a few more in the works.
Outstanding.
Yeah. So this is again about sort of poltergeists by Louis Proud. This is a really interesting book. I mean, so we've just published a handful of books now since 2017, but we're really expanding. This is Jack Hunter again, Greening the Paranormal, looking at ecology and the role that man's relationship, humanity's relationship to nature, and the intersections between the paranormal phenomena as well. And again, another one by Jack Hunter. So we're publishing a number of books now, and moving into 2021, we'll be sort of publishing quite a few more.
Now, is there anything that you'd like to tell us about titles that we should be looking for in 2021, or you want to wait to roll them out a little later and not on this format?
How long have we got?
Oh, we have more than 15 minutes.
Okay. So in 2021 then, I haven't announced this formally at this point, but as I say, we're moving into 2021 with quite a few titles on the slate, one of which is by Debbie Jordan Corball, who's a mutual friend of ours.
Yes.
Debbie was the central figure in Bud Hopkins' 1987 book Intruders, and also the figure in the TV adaptation, which came out a few years later.
That's right.
TV miniseries. So Debbie wrote a book in the early 90s, which was a furtherance of her paranormal and UFO experiences that were not catalogued in Bud's Intruders.
Yeah, with her sister Kathy.
And since the late 1980s, when Intruders was written, Debbie's experiences have continued throughout her life.
Yes.
And she's had a very, very astonishing and traumatic, but also exciting and challenging life.
Yes.
And what she's written is essentially an autobiography that really catalogues the utterly astonishing events that have happened on a personal level, on a very human level, but also in terms of various paranormal phenomena. So this is a book that I'm in the process of editing now. It's nearly finished, and I'm
looking forward to it.
Me too. It's a really really personal project for Debbie, and this is going to be published within the next few months. Alongside that, for the past several months, we've been trying to at August Night, we've been trying to negotiate a deal on bringing back into publication 2 titles from Bud Hopkins, which have been out of print for between 30 and 40 years now. 2 of the most influential UFO books to have ever been written, I would say. Certainly Missing Time, which was written in 1981 by Bud Hopkins, which was responsible for putting that term missing time into the ufological lexicon.
Yes.
Hugely influential book. One of the first, maybe the first serious study of the UFO abduction phenomenon to have been written. And then the follow-up book, which you just mentioned, which you just showed there, which was Intruders, which was written in 1987.
Yeah.
2 very, very influential books, which have long been out of print, but which we're now bringing back into print through August Night this year, hopefully within the next 2-3 months. So, I'm very, very pleased and excited about that.
What we're going to do now is move into another realm of photos, and I know who the gentleman on the wall is, and will you tell our listeners and viewers who this other notable figure is?
That was 2019 in Phoenix, Arizona, when I was a speaker at the UFO Congress that year, and that's Greg Bishop.
Yeah,
my good friend Greg Bishop, who was he's fantastic, and Greg and I have been in touch since probably around 2015 when I was writing Silver Screen Sources, actually, and because I said that was when I first contacted. I've been aware of him for years before that.
Yeah.
Greg's a veteran in the field. To my mind, maybe alongside Jacques Vallée, one of the most innovative thinkers in ufology. And
he really is, and I have eminent respect for him. He's certainly going to be a future guest on this show, and also one of the nicest people in the work. And in the background there, that's a great mural of David Bowie on the wall behind you guys. Very California.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Very Southeast.
Yeah, and Greg is, I should just say quickly as well, Greg is currently in the early stages of developing volume 2 of Reframing the Debate. So we'll be hopefully publishing that at some point in the not too distant future.
Terrific. Again, we could do show after show, and hopefully you will return as a guest and on the independent, Meanwhile Here on Earth platform for panel discussions and the like. But right now, let's focus our remaining time on some very iconic films exemplified in these stills. Now that, for me, is one of the great UFO chandeliers of all time.
Yeah, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Spielberg's. I think, personally, Spielberg's... people talk about Schindler's List and E.T. being his most personal films, but I really firmly believe that Close Encounters is his most personal work. And I think it's his most passionate work as well. It's not a perfect movie. It's not a perfect movie. It's actually a bit of a mess. And on a narrative level, it doesn't even make an awful lot of sense. But it's every single frame is just infused with this childlike wonder at the universe, and it's just astonishing piece of work.
The impact that it had on so many of us who were fortunate enough to see it in the theater for the first time, I frankly will never forget. And it's a film I return to occasionally, but it mainstreamed the UFO-related subject in a way that I don't think any film ever had before it.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this was a movie. This was really the culmination of Spielberg's childhood and adolescent obsession with UFOs. Spielberg, for those who don't know, was completely obsessed with the UFO enigma from throughout his childhood. And the very first film he made, the very first full-length film he made at an amateur level was called Firelight, which was actually the blueprint for Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which he made when he was 16 years old. And so Spielberg was really well read on the subject at a very early age. And all of that knowledge, all of this factual ufological knowledge, formed the basis of this supposedly science fiction movie. And it is, at the time, Spielberg said that this was not science fiction, but science speculation. And that's why NASA tried. That's why NASA didn't want him to make it. This is kind of part of the poster for Joe Dante's 1985 movie Explorers, which is kind kind of this really had a big impact on me as a kid. It's not an amazing movie, but it's a really charming and funny one, and it starred a young River Phoenix and Ethan Hawke, and it just completely captured my imagination as a kid. And the idea that kids could communicate with aliens and fly off into space. That's him again. That's Ethan Hawke, and of course he died when he was 23, I think, really tragically. Yeah. Ethan Hawke, I think, has gone on to have a really interesting career.
Yeah.
Another one, Flight of the Navigator. Again, it is Disney's engagement with the UFO phenomenon here. This is a really interesting film, actually, a really good film. It stands up. It's quite an emotional film. It still stands up to this day.
I think a lot of adults think of it as a kid's film, but it's also a film for any thinking person to watch and enjoy.
Yeah. So that would have been 5 years old when that came out in 1986, but I would have watched that throughout my childhood. Yeah, big impact on me.
Well, here's another film that had a big impact on a lot of people, although famously screenwriter Tracy Torme was compelled, no choice given by the studio head, to rewrite part of it because the studio head was essentially a word I can't repeat on the air right now, but he was a jerk. And unfortunately, you didn't need a newer, cooler version of what he was compelled to rewrite. However, no question about it, Fire in the Sky is a very important film. It's, as many of us know, very deeply based on truth, the actual truths of which are, and it's actually a great double feature, if you want to look at it like that, wonderfully documented in one of the best UFO-related documentaries of recent years, Travis, the True Story of Travis Walton, available from On Wings, ONWINGES production company. But yes, this film was a knockout in its own way for sure.
Yeah, I mean, if you separate it from the actual case, it stands up as quite a powerful drama and kind of horror. It's significant in history in terms of the intersections between UFOs and Hollywood, because this was really the first Hollywood UFO movie that pushed ufology into the realms of horror. Yeah. And then that had a huge impact on many alien movies to follow.
Yeah. And we're going to move fairly lively because, again, any of these images can bring up a full weekend worth of seminars. One of the most impacting television shows in television history.
And one of the best, I would say, as well. I mean, it's just a fantastic show. I mean, not only fascinating from a UFO paranormal standpoint, but also just in terms of the characters that it creates and the stories that it tells. Truly. Absolutely brilliant show. And yeah, the impact. I mean, many books have been written just about the X-Files, and so I kind of skip over it to a large extent in my book because you could write so much about it, but its impact really can't be understated.
Yeah, and it gave us a mantra for our time. 4 of the most significant words in the history of the modern world, although it goes back millennia as well. And upon these 4 words, great truths are built and great deceptions as well.
Absolutely.
Our friend Bryce Zabel, another pioneer in television, with a series that only ran for 2 seasons, as I recall, but boy, it could have run for 10 as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, I mean, it only went for 1, but it does seem like, I know what you mean. It does seem like longer than that. And this was 1996. It started and went from 96 to 97, and this was sort of an alternative to the X-Files in a similar vein, but it had its own unique kind of take on the UFO mythology. And this was this had a really big impact on me. It had left an indelible impression on me, and I didn't think as a teenager that I would go on to work with Bryce, who wrote the forward to Silver Screen Saucers. And but there's all sorts of there's a whole, I won't go into here, we don't have time, but there's a very fascinating story about what happened behind the scenes of Dark Skies, where Bryce and his co-producer Brent Friedman were approached by what seemed to be government insiders who wanted to seed their series with inside information.
There we go. And another very important film with a great American actress at the helm.
Yeah, I've included this as one of my favorite. I would consider this a UFO movie. By the way, I consider a UFO movie doesn't have to actually include a UFO in a literal sense, but it's something that explores the idea of humanity's first contact with an alien intelligence from a human perspective rather than from an alien one. And this is a really powerful, beautiful movie that just is endlessly watchable.
I should jump in and say we're talking here about Contact, which not only starred, but as I recall, was directed and or produced by Jodie Foster.
It was directed by Robert Zemeckis, who did Back to the Future, and it was written by James Hart, who's actually a UFO believer, interestingly enough, but obviously based on the book by Carl Sagan.
It is a thinking person's UFO film, to be sure. And then one of my all-time favorite B movies. There is a remake to it. Please don't waste your time. With all due respect to the people involved, this is what B films are all about. And as you write so eloquently and so insightfully in your book, this film functions on a number of levels. And first and foremost, it is one of the most entertaining. It gives us characters that are indelible. And if only the visitors from space were like the elegant, sophisticated, and very restrained Michael Rennie.
Yeah, it's a great film. And and interestingly enough, this was one of the first UFO movies to have been made. It wasn't the first, but it was one of the first. And you say B picture, but actually this was an anomaly of the era, because this was a significant studio picture produced by 20th Century Fox.
I'm sorry, I just need to mention that the film we're talking about is The Day the Earth Stood Still. Please continue.
Right, yeah, The Day the Earth Stood Still, 1951, directed by Robert Wise, who's one of the best craftsmen in Hollywood history. This was an impeccably made film with a good production budget, fantastic special effects. And this was a studio picture, and this was quite an anomaly because most of the movies that followed throughout the 50s on the UFO flying saucer subject were very low budget, schlocky B pictures. And but this one really incorporated a lot of factual ufological details and ideas. It was way ahead of its time ufologically and cinematically, and it's essential viewing for anyone really who's interested in UFOs, but also anyone who's interested in sci-fi or movies in general.
It also has a remarkably powerful and quite unforgettable soundtrack. Now, this one, I love that insert there, 2.5 years in the making. It's really quite a wonderful little mention there. This film is often brushed over in more intellectual filmatic circles. I love this movie. I loved it when I was a kid. I still will watch it usually once a year, and it is completely engaging, a very simple series of special effects, but what great storytelling.
Yeah, I think it's a great film. It's such an enjoyable film. It's probably my favorite. Well, I would say easily my favorite UFO movie of the era. More so, I prefer it to The Day the Earth Stood Still. I think it's a more enjoyable film, to be honest with you. It's not as good technically, but I think it's more fun. And I include it here because, of course, this incorporates ufological references. You've got this. This guy here on the left is essentially a Nordic, as reported by many of the contactees of the era, with the generous forehead, human-looking, blonde or kind of white, light-colored hair, with the tight-fitting one-piece suits and the belt. This is that guy's basically Orthon with shorter hair. From Adamski's reports. So this was a movie of the era that was incorporating, a lot of the ufological iconography from the UFO literature.
And again, remembering we have listeners, and I'm still new at this, folks. We're talking about a film called This Island Earth, and a wonderful still, a great black and white from it. Yeah, as a kid, I remember saying, these guys have very high foreheads. And
just that's actually a still from the 1992 miniseries Intruders, which was again adapted from the Bud Hopkins book of the same name, which was based on largely on the experience of Debbie Corbell, whose book we'll be publishing later this year.
Indeed. And from here, we go into another powerhouse of a film written by the extraordinarily influential Whitley Strieber, based on his smash international bestseller.
Yeah, Communion, 1989 movie based on his book. And this divides opinion, this film, and I know a lot of people really don't like it, but just as a piece of cinema, I really like it a lot. I think it's a very unusual film, and I think it captures the really strange atmosphere that Whitley conjures in his book. And of course the screenplay is written by Whitley, and I think it's definitely a flawed film, to say the least, but there's many very, very powerful and hypnotic sequences in the movie, which I think really effectively communicate some of the more bizarre and high strange aspects of the phenomenon as reported by experiencers. And I really have a lot of time for this, and I think Christopher Walken is fantastically bizarre and great in it as well. All of the performances, I think, are fantastic in it. I think it's a really, really good movie.
This really takes us right up to the end of our show. And all I can say, Robbie, is a pleasure having you on. It went far too fast. I hope you'll return. We will be returning next week by not chance, but with Debbie White Cabell, who was in fact the central figure in Bud Hopkins' international bestseller Intruders. This is Robbie Graham and Peter Robbins on Meanwhile Here on Earth on KGRA Digital Broadcasting, signing off. If you have enjoyed this show, please tell your friends about it. See you next week.
Thanks so much, Peter.